friends. It's a great privilege to chair a lecture delivered by Professor Uman. I thank Professor Tilak for giving me this opportunity. Professor Uman has covered a topic which has tremendous complexity, which has accumulated, I should say, over not just decades, but perhaps for more than a century, ever since India's national movement began. The complexity over the question of which language should be used to teach children has been around us. So this afternoon we had a taste of the various layers of the issue, the dimensions, the proportions of the complexity, and also the nuances which arise out of the specificity of the Indian situation. Professor Uman started by portraying to us a larger picture of the world. He challenged the sort of world system on this matter, which Joshua Fishman tried to create. He reminded us, Professor Uman reminded us of how the idea of the nation state shaped the fate of languages in parts of the world where both the emergence of the nation state and the emergence of the nation state under industrialized conditions shaped the destiny of societies and their culture, language being one part of it. And then after that broad picture he portrayed for us, he brought us into the Indian situation, where we now have a certain history to look back at since independence. And that history reminds us in different ways, depending on what perspective we take, how complex the task of what we call nation building has proved. We couldn't have had a better teacher than Professor Uman to take us through this very complex terrain of the language issue. What he wanted to plead for today is actually a matter on which there has never been any dearth of pleaders. I can't think of almost any major nationalist thinker since mid-19th century who did not plead for the use of the child's mother tongue as the obvious choice for the medium in which the child should be taught. One can think of many, from Vivekananda and Gandhi and Tagore to various others, right up to our times. There has never been any dearth of pleaders on this matter. Yet, Professor Uman chose to conclude his lecture with choosing the role of an advocate. And in this role, one could sense the sense of lost opportunity, which he, like many of us today in this hall, would think is valid. A lost opportunity for a certain kind of nation building, which would have happened had universal literacy been a priority at a certain phase, in a certain phase of nation building. A loss of opportunity in the sense that we perhaps would have been a different kind of economy and society today if primary education had been accessible to every child in this natural, you can say, medium of education, and so on and so forth. And this afternoon one had that feeling hanging in the air in this Gulmohar Hall that we are a nation which has a lot to, in some sense, regret about about certain policies which we wish had been made. As somebody listening to this lecture, I couldn't but think over the very difficult role he assigned to Professor Tilak, namely to act as a National University of Educational Planning in a manner that the planning process includes language. Now that reminds us of Fishman's dream. Planning language, language planning as it used to be called in the 60s and 70s. In our own country, we had very eminent language planners, and late Professor Pattanayak used to remind us that language planning is a dangerous exercise. This is because education itself is a bit dangerous. Pattanayak had a lot to do with Mr. Ivan Illich, who pointed out to the modern world as it was modernizing at a certain tremendous speed. Hold on, think about it as you proceed with education. It's a double-edged instrument. There have been great nations which brought themselves to terrible times by using this instrument a bit too ambitiously. And sometimes you think, well, if education doesn't always succeed in its mission, thank God it doesn't. Failures of education of a certain kind are all over global history. And whenever education oversteps its role as an agency that attempts to shape human creativity, when it oversteps that role, the result is homogeneity. The result is an overbearing centrality, the kinds of tendencies that Professor Uman was questioning in most of his lecture. These tendencies led the world to catastrophes of various kinds. We just celebrated, not celebrated, but remembered the 70th anniversary of Hiroshima 2 days ago. It is also a reminder of what happens when nation-states take themselves very seriously and when they are constituted around certain frozen ideals like homogeneity of language or homogeneity of culture and so on and so forth. Now that danger in the nation-state using education to fulfill its goals is always around, and that is why progressive educational theory throughout the 20th century has been skeptical of this national project. We are currently passing through a phase in which we do have every good reason to feel skeptical of this. Unfortunately, skepticism is often interpreted as cynicism, but I think as educationists, we all have the business of maintaining skepticism without being cynical and seeing how is it that despite such tremendously well-informed leadership that India was blessed with, unlike our neighboring state of Pakistan, where this kind of leadership could not prevail for very long, how come we lost so many opportunities? And that question does offer me some room to comment in an otherwise very well-crafted and extremely persuasive lecture. When I look at Article 351 of the Indian Constitution, which Professor Uman read out in detail, yes, of course, if you see it as a single sentence structure, you feel like saying, well, wow, Indian civil servants are wonderful people. They know how to put across very, very complex ideas in single sentences that end up meaning very little. If you see it simply as an articulation of a policy or a kind of injunction that the Constitution wants to put forth, one is of course struck by the kinds of contradictions that Professor Uman brought out in that sentence, which on the one hand talks about Hindustani and then talks about drawing primarily on Sanskrit and then on other languages and so on and so forth in one long formulation. We can have lots of problems with that, yes. But there is a third way to look at that sentence. And that third way is also the text of India's nation building. The very complex text which we live every day, not just in Parliament, but in every classroom. Article 351 reminds us of the many struggles which shaped that article. as discourse, it carries the imprint of its times, in which perhaps the Constitution wouldn't have been able to come to any conclusions about language issues, official language, let alone national language, and so on, had it not been for this tremendous and almost absurd act of accommodation. The struggle was not just between Hindi and English, or Hindi and other Indian languages. The struggle was within Hindi itself. And the word Hindustani carries the memory of that struggle. It's a struggle within a language which had emerged barely 150 years earlier and had a very short history. It was a project of its own kind. As great Hindi journalist, the late Rajendra Mathur, reminded us, we are in the middle of many Nirmanadheen projects. The nation itself was under construction, but so was Hindi. It was a language which expressed a certain kind of aspiration. This aspiration had hit many parts of India, not just northern India. It had absorbed many different kinds of imaginations. But it was a fractured project within itself. And the fractures were around the question of Urdu, which our neighboring nation declared as its national language, thereby smearing that beautiful language with a certain caste, with a certain imprint, which was the imprint of partition. And then there was Hindustani, which many claimed was actually half the spirit of Hindi. And Hindi and Hindustani themselves were locked in a battle, at least since 1920s. The world of Hindi was divided between these. So, what happens in the Constituent Assembly? If one reads those debates, one realizes that accommodation was the only principle to move forward. And accommodation was done at many, many levels. And this is just one of those, you can say, anecdotes that we can borrow from our very difficult to interpret history as a modern nation. This is one of those many anecdotes which remind us how complex modernity has proved for countries like India, which have succeeded in staying democratic without making our encounter with modernity as cruel as it was for a nation like Great Britain or most of the West European nations. Modernity was not a simple experience of dissemination of ideas. No, it was an experience of terrible misery and hunger for all those all those villages which got destroyed in the course of the Industrial Revolution. Millions of children turned into beggars. When we read the novels of Charles Dickens, then we realize what price Britain paid for its modernity, and what price Europe paid for its modernity in the First and the Second World Wars. Our price has been a bit less. I agree with psychoanalyst Sudhir Kakkar, who says that perhaps we didn't have to pay as heavy a price to modernize ourselves. At least so far we haven't. But Kakkar himself says, in the history of the modern nation and state in India, it's still not dark enough. It's only 2 o'clock. And in his very famous essay, Many Ayodhyas, he said that. We don't know really what it is we can do that our forefathers could not do. In this city, we have one major model among the various public schools, one model of a school which says, well, no matter what our company is, we are in the company of the elite public schools of Delhi. But that school says, no, but we will have a different language policy. We will bring our children up to grade 5 through the language called Hindi, even though we are a school set up by a Gujarati trust. You all know which school I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of Sardar Patel. I've always described it as a school in my mind and among friends as a very good place for worried adults who don't have time to think about education. Their conscience will be served nicely by this school. I have great respect for Sardar Patel. It has survived in a very difficult environment of English medium public schools and has held up the ideal of allowing children to learn through a language which is part of their environment. Now, Hindi is not necessarily the mother tongue of all the children who go to Sardar Patel's school. But Sardar Patel has used Hindi both instrumentally and symbolically to build a certain identity for itself as a school that dares to depart from the beaten norm. Very few institutions of that kind can be thought of, at least in this city. Although around the country, one does find institutions that dare do that. But the system itself is not in a position to do much about where it finds itself. And that is more or less, I think, what Professor Govinda and Professor Tilak would probably want to endorse. That even though we are here celebrating the 9th foundation day of this university and with a long history, constraints of planning in a diverse and multi-layered hierarchical society where aspirations are competing, both at the individual and collective levels. In such a society, one of the last things one would like to imagine one is planning is language. One says that not so much in despair. One says that out of respect for how we function as a society. Even if we are still learning to function as a democracy and as a nation state, we do need to pay some respect to how we function as a society. Not out of chauvinism of any kind, but out of sheer will that we need to pay attention to this aspect of our society, which of course has a lot to learn from the kinds of debates in which institutions like ours engage all the time. Our system doesn't serve this society well. When I say our system, I mean the education system. A very short anecdote from the city of Bombay, where I happened to go once when I was serving the NCRT. That anecdote is about a visit to an area which was used by the Bombay Municipal Corporation to house several schools. There were some 9 schools in one complex. And the municipal officer who was taking me around, he said to me that all these schools have different medium of instruction. So I was quite struck by that thought, that in this single campus, children are learning in 9 different languages. So naturally I asked them, what are these languages? And he explained to me that there is a Marathi medium school, there's a Kannada medium school, there's an English medium, there's a Hindi medium, and there is a Tamil medium school and Gujarati medium school, and so on and so forth. Which one would you like to visit, sir? He asked me. Now, as a Hindi bhashi, a rather unashamed Hindi bhashi, I said, well, Hindi medium, dikha dijiye, that will be great. So he took me to the Hindi medium school, and I sat down in grade 1 class, watching what this teacher was teaching from what I thought was a pretty wretched textbook that the Maharashtra Corporation of Textbooks had produced. As an NCRT person, I always believed that our books were the best, and I didn't know why others were not using them. But anyhow, I endured that lesson, and then when there was a sort of a bit of a lull after about 15-20 minutes, I asked this teacher, what is, where did you grow up? You speak such wonderful Hindi. She said, oh, I'm a Marathi person. I said, that's wonderful. So tell me, who are these children in your class? And this class had a ratio of, the PTR was something like 1:75. Children were all over the floor, and they were, it was very crowded class. So I asked her, what do these children speak at home? And she said they speak all kinds of languages. Some of them are from houses, families where the husband is from Bihar and he has married a Marathi woman. Some of them are from Uttar Pradesh, and one of them has married. Many of them have married in Gujarat. Somebody has married, and so on. There are Tamil medium children who have married a Hindi. whose parents are a Tamil Hindi family, and so on and so forth. So that was quite interesting to learn that that the concept of mother tongue is not all that clear when you think about mothers and fathers speaking, coming from different places in this very dynamic urban reality of the present-day city of Mumbai. So I asked her, are there children here who are actually from Marathi-speaking homes? And she said, yes, quite a few. In fact, Marathi is all over the city of Mumbai, and so many children are from this linguistic background. So then I asked her this question, which has become a great memory, the answer to which has become a great memory in my mind. I asked her, when a child whose home language is Marathi doesn't quite follow what you are saying in Hindi, or doesn't quite follow what the Hindi textbook is saying, do you explain to that child in Marathi, because you know Marathi so well? And you know what she said? She said, sir, I'm not allowed to speak Marathi in this class. When she said that, two of her officers were with us, and we looked at each other, and I knew what they were saying. They were saying that, yes, she has chosen to be posted in this school, which is a Hindi medium school, and therefore, where is her right to speak in her mother tongue? Even if it will improve the comprehension of these children who are from Marathi medium homes, and so on and so forth. The NCERT came up with a kind of an accommodative formula, and as usual, it didn't get very far, but it still is a nice formula, a bit like the three-language formula, but the NCERT in its national curriculum framework formulated the idea of a multilingual classroom, where the teacher will teach not just in one language, because that's the language which is official policy, but in whatever language children will understand best. So instead of being particularly rigid about what ought to be or sad about what has become, perhaps as a society we can look forward to a future when education itself will be a bit more flexible, when the teacher will be a little more relaxed about her or his role as a teacher. And that is perhaps the most realistic dream one can have in a time when teaching itself is under so much attack and education is being used as a source of, as a means of regimentation. One can't have all that big a dream today. But yes, distant dreams are very good too. The late J.P. Naik used to say, let's have a plan for today, one for tomorrow, and let's keep a plan in the drawer for the day after tomorrow. And for that plan, yes, I vote for mother tongue as a medium of instruction. But I today see the many aspirations, especially in the classes of society which feel that they have been dominated by English medium elites, their aspiration to send their children to schools which claim to be English medium in whatever manner they deliver it is a different matter. Across the country you see that. And this is not, of course, a new aspiration. The Hindi novelist Panishwar Nath Renu, in his Mela Aanchal, published in early 50s, has a character saying, "Ek din aayega Bharat mein, jab har jhopdi se ABC ka jhankar sunai dega." That day has come, friends. And we will live through this period of our history when every family has this aspiration that their children should learn English. We can't denigrate that aspiration. That aspiration is part of a larger aspiration to participate in an ongoing process. Call it the market, call it democracy, what you will. But as a dynamic society, we must witness what we witness around us on this matter of language. And then perhaps we will realize that yes, there may have been some opportunities which to our generation look like lost. But perhaps the word opportunity itself is a word that doesn't quite convey what the teacher tries to achieve. Teacher tries to achieve some kind of relationship with the child. And language is a means of establishing that relationship. I thank Professor Uman for giving us such a stimulating lecture and Professor Tilak for giving me the opportunity to comment on it. And I congratulate UPA on its 9th foundation day. Thank you.